Mark chapter 8, verses 8 through 20, chapter 8, verses 22 through 38. It's a bit of a lengthy passage, but we're going to finish the chapter today. As Mark, we get to the high point of the book here, beginning at verse 22. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. When he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see men, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And he called to him the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his life? For what can a man gain? What can a man give in return for his life? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Amen. Amen. Well, in any book you're reading, any movie you watch or television series, there's always a bit of an arc to a high point. And at that high point, you can see maybe where things have been building, and then there is a moment or two, a scene, an episode. And then from there, maybe the rest of whatever you're reading, watching, starts to make more sense. We are at that point here in the book of Mark. Book of Mark is 16 chapters long. This is chapter 8, so the way the chapter and verse divisions fell out, of course, they would make this the high point of the book. But what you really see as Mark has been building his argument that Jesus is the Son of God who has come from heaven to earth to provide us as a sacrifice of redemption for the forgiveness of our sins, what he's come to provide now, it's becoming much more clear, and Jesus is going to spell it out very, very clearly here. This is really where the thing takes a turn, where you move from not just being informed about the identity of Jesus, but you really see his mission explained clearly and for what it really means to be a follower of Christ. But of course, not everybody is going to be in the same place when it comes to their understanding. There's going to be some people who out and out reject him, that live, if you like, in blindness. There's going to be some people where it's becoming a little bit more clear, like the disciples, but yet not totally that clear when it comes to the real mission and what's expected of his followers. And then there's going to be some people who totally get it. They see the identity, they understand the mission, and they follow Jesus, and they're ready to take up his footsteps. So as you think of that as in kind of a word picture of sight, we get into the end of this chapter, really half of this chapter, and it begins with what I would call a parable on sight. Even though it's a miracle of healing a blind man, it's really a parable about what it takes when you're seeing Jesus clearly. And so you're going to see in a two-stage miracle something that's going to work out in a two-stage understanding of what Jesus has come to do. And of course, Peter, we love Peter because he's going to speak right up. And he's going to be the living example, the living epistle of what it means to be caught in that first stage of understanding the identity of Jesus. But really, when you sum it up, To see Jesus is really to see his cross as central to his identity. And that's what, as the people are listening to this, the disciples and the crowds, that's what they're going to hear, and that's what they're going to see eventually. That to see Jesus clearly is to see his cross. To see his identity as your identity, then you too must take up your cross and follow him. But there is a progression of understanding this. And Peter's going to help us work through that progression. So we're just going to look at the miracle, which is really a parable about Jesus opening blind eyes, and then we're going to look at Jesus' identity and the implications for us. So first of all, the two-stage miracle here, that only Jesus can open blind eyes. Only Jesus can open your blind eyes and my blind eyes. At this point, it's a fair question to be asked. In this epistle, or at least in this gospel, I should say, how well are the disciples really doing at this moment in seeing Jesus' true identity? You know, they're doing okay. They've been following him. They've been basking in the large crowds, the feedings, the healings. He's becoming more popular. But at some level, their minds are still caught up in what they see right in front of them. Remember just a few verses back when he had fed the 4,000, he was teaching about the leaven of the Pharisees and teaching about what unbelief might do, and they were discussing about not having enough bread to eat that night. He asked the question, having eyes to see, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? There's this question that's happening in this chapter. You've seen what's happened, but do you really see? Do you really understand it? And the answer is, not quite. Not quite. And so now, here comes a blind man. He's brought forward by his friends. You'll notice right away, it's not the faith of the blind man is coming. He's not crying out saying, heal me, heal me. His friends bring him forward. Maybe it's their faith that's brought him to this point. But it's not necessarily the blind man's faith. He's still blind, physically and likely spiritually. At least at that moment, his friends bring him up to Jesus. First century blindness, way more widespread. Way more, I would say, problematic and probably in many cases horrific for those who would suffer with it. Not only for the stigma that came with it and the social ostracism, but there just wasn't really good medical advancement on how a person would cope. So if you can imagine the blindness of this man, eyes crusted over, dirt probably all over him, people tired of dealing with him. Maybe that's even the reason why those people brought him forward, because they didn't want to deal with him. Maybe the last hope they had was with Jesus. But there he is, caked, maybe even with insects or flies flying around his eyes. Not a sight that you'd want to see. But there he is standing right in front of Jesus. And I think what you see with Jesus is an insight to how Jesus deals not only with the physically blind and the way he reaches out to this man, but also, I think, in some way, insight into how he deals with spiritual blindness with all of us. Notice what he does here. He takes him by the hand. He takes him by the hand. And he begins to lead him. It's a lot of insight into Jesus' care for the helpless, isn't it? Jesus is constantly helping the helpless. And he doesn't do it saying, maybe in a way we might like, come on, let's go. Frustration, but he's gently dealing with this. This may have been the 4,000th person with the same illness, the same ailment he's seen 1,000 times. And yet, he takes him by the hand very gently, a hand that maybe hadn't been washed in who knows how long, in places that we wouldn't even want to understand. But here he is grabbing the hand of this man. He leads him out of the village. Just the two of them. They walk together. They have a moment together. You might even think about, I wonder what he talked to him about. Sure, the disciples are trailing behind. There's probably people in the village that have no idea what's going on, but here he is walking with this man. Maybe this man is getting an explanation of why Jesus came from Jesus himself. But what you see with Jesus is not only his gentle intrusion into his life, but you also see Jesus relating in a personal kind of relationship with the man. Spiritual blindness, when God is walking us out of spiritual blindness, there is a sense in which he is taking hold of us, dirty, filthy, but gently leading us and taking us by the hand, leading us into a place of a relationship. Third thing he does, he spits on his eyes. This I rack my brain over. This is different. This not spitting on mud, spitting on his eyes. I started thinking about spit. You got to spit twice at least, right? So you got to spit on the left eye, poof, and then you got to spit on the right eye, poof. And I'm trying to think of what that would have looked like. What that would have looked like to the disciples. What is he doing? This is strange. But there's one thing about what's going to happen to this man. He is going to have a story to tell. Because Jesus just doesn't go around spitting on people. But he spit on me. And you remember me? Oh, we remember you. Yeah, not exactly saline solution, but Jesus had something for him. And when you think about it, the faculties that would have been so heightened for this man, with the absence of his eyes, likely from his birth, or at least early on in his life, his senses of his touch and hearing would have been that much more heightened. And to hear the sound of Jesus' mouth and to feel the touch of his hand would have been so heightened, it's almost as if Jesus is saying, I'm coming into your world now. I'm speaking your language. You may not be able to see me, but you can feel me and you can hear me. And so Jesus just has a very unique way with all of us. With faculties sometimes dulled and other times heightened. Jesus has a way of coming into our lives and speaking a language to us that we as individuals can understand. He broke into your life. He intruded in your time and your family. He did something at a time in your life which, when you look back on it, you say, that was the exact moment I needed him. And he knew exactly what I needed. And he met my need. And so Jesus comes. He takes the man by the hand. He leads him personally. He goes into his life, speaks a language he can understand. And then he lays his hands on him and he asks him the question, do you see anything? Do you see anything? And the response is great, so honest. I see men, but they look like trees walking. Okay. We're getting warmer. And this is the question, I think, of spiritually blind people. It's a great question. What do you see? What do you see? Same kind of question he can ask of all of us in regard to Jesus into our lives. What do we see about him? What is it? Are we completely blind? Is it hazy? Is it clear? What do you see? This has got to be thrilling for the man because something's starting to build for him. I see something. I haven't seen for a long time or even ever, but now I see something. It's like this movement. It's hard to describe. And then Jesus does it again. He lays his hands on him and his vision comes. Literally, clear from far off. It's better than 20/20. The eye chart is on the other side of the room, and he's doing like the little Z's and the H's and all the stuff we miss. He's got it all. It's come back perfectly. It's totally restored. It's amazing. And so the question really is, what do we see in this parable? What do we see about Jesus? Well, I think it's that only Jesus can open your eyes so that you see him more clearly and yourself more clearly. Only Jesus can do that. When you think about the New Testament, you don't see the apostles going around and curing sight problems. The only time is Ananias in I think it's in Acts 9. But that was a Jesus-caused blindness, and I think a Jesus directly caused miracle of sight with Saul. But you don't see that from the apostles. You only see the curing of people born blind by Jesus himself, which I think is a huge, huge picture for us, that only Jesus can open our blind eyes. That's it. That's what we've got to pray for with people. If your eyes have been opened and you understand his identity and mission, you got to pray as these people led this man forth, that Jesus would open blind eyes, because he's the only one who can. We all know how frustrating it can be. Maybe we've been talking to people, you've been thinking with people, and you just sense that it's just not happened yet. And the prayer is so simple. Oh, Jesus, will you just open their blind eyes? Will you lead them by the hand? Will you take them in a personal way and show them their greatest need can only be met by you? Please, please, Jesus, do this. I think that's what this parable of this healing is teaching us. And that's why I read Ephesians 1:17 and 18 this morning as our prayer, that he may open the eyes of our hearts, that he may enlighten us, so we might know the vast riches of his work, his presence, his graciousness. People are all at different spots in their understanding. There's blind people who don't see Jesus at all. There's some who are moving in his direction, saying things like, "You are the Christ." And there are people that totally get it. But you can see from this little account, there are people who are on that path. And Peter, of course, becomes, I think, a wonderful living example of the men walking like trees. He becomes, I think, the word picture here as we get into the next little section here from 27 to 30. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Again, a great diagnostic question. Who do people say that I am? Oh, this is great. This is like a classroom. Well, some people say you're Elijah. Some people say you're John the Baptist. Some people say you're one of the prophets. It's interesting that the people that the disciples were trafficking with, the people they were kind of moving around with, they saw Jesus in a somewhat religious role, but he was more of a preparatory figure in their eyes. That's what, when you think about Elijah, the prophets, and John the Baptist, they were all preparers of someone to come. So Jesus, you're just kind of in that line. That's what most people think of you. You're not really who you say you are. You're kind of the one before the next one who's going to come. That's the way most people saw him. It was a religious, Old Testament kind of context. But as you read the book of Mark, what you notice is that there are all kinds of different reactions to Jesus. And that mirrors, I think, to some degree, the kinds of reactions we see today. You had the soldiers. The soldiers that were putting Jesus on the cross, they had a job to do. They weren't necessarily concerned with what Jesus was saying, what he had done. They just had a job to do. They were blind to whatever it was that he had stood for, and they were going to put him where he needed to be put. That's it. They had a job. They were distracted. Jesus, Son of God, didn't enter into the picture. This man just needed to die. You had other people who were like the religious leaders. They were already convinced that their own moral goodness was their way to God. That was the way of earning favor for them. So all Jesus is really doing here is getting in the way. And for a lot of people who are morally good, they're like, well, don't talk to me about Jesus, okay? I'm a good person. And I don't need that. I found my own way. And it's not by that, not by his way. And then you had people like Pilate, who just gave into the crowd. Whoever people say he is, I'm fine with. If it's a matter of convenience for me personally, so I can keep my job, I can keep my lifestyle, I can keep my family intact, I can keep my reputation. If peer pressure dictates that this is what people think of Jesus, that's what I think. Fine, I wash my hands of it. And then finally, you had the most unlikely person to actually identify Jesus, who was the centurion at the end of the book. Surely this man was the Son of God. The centurion gets the last line of the play. He gets the best part. We don't even know the guy's name. It's just he's standing there, and even through his work, through his reputation, whatever it might be, all be on the line, he makes this declaration. It's exactly what had been said at the beginning of the book. This man is the Son of God. The reactions are all different. And the most unlikely people are the ones who get it. See, the people who are likely don't get it. And so here Mark is just helping us understand these things. Here comes Peter. Jesus asked the question now, this is not theoretical now, this is for you. Who do you say I am? Who do you say? And of course, Peter, probably speaking on behalf of everybody, is right there, ready to chime in. You are the Christ. Correct. Correct. And then verse 30, I love verse 30. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Now, Jesus, why would you do that? He just got the right answer. You got to keep reading to see why Jesus would say, don't tell anyone about this, because Peter doesn't really understand what he's saying. He doesn't understand the full implications of what it meant for Jesus to be the Messiah. He had his own ideas. His own ideas involve glory, power, feeding, healing. We take the world. Not so fast, Peter. And so we're going to see exactly why. There's a lot of reasons why Jesus is telling people not to tell anybody about him. But there's something in the protection of his identity and his message that he doesn't want prematurely or falsely to be spread. And so Peter here is going to get a lesson in messianic identity. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man, and here's a very important word here, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And here's a pregnant little sentence. And he said this plainly. Okay, this wasn't a Sudoku puzzle. This wasn't a weird, like the Matrix movie where you have to watch it 15 times. You still don't know what's going on. It's not anything. Matrix was so long. I just totally dated myself there. People are like, the Matrix. I'm like, what was that, like the 90s or something? Okay, you're all asleep at this point, so wake up. Here we are. We're in Mark 8. Now, what Jesus is doing here, he's plainly saying, this must happen. What's endemic to my identity is three things: suffering, submission, and self-denial. That is endemic to who I am. And as he is teaching this plainly, so that the fisherman, the tax collector, the zealot, the guy who's, maybe at the point of even thinking about rejecting Jesus at this point, they are hearing it totally in plain language. And Peter, he's starting to put two and two together here. Now, wait a second. You wonder if Jesus is telling him these things, and they're looking at each other like, no, this isn't the program. This is not what we signed up for. Who's going to tell him? Peter, I will. Yeah, I got to correct him. And Peter, you have to love a guy like this, because he's going to go out front and do the hard work here. He's going to confront the Son of God about what it means to be the Son of God. So he's going to do something that none of us in our right mind would ever do. That as Jesus is talking about the suffering, the submission, and the self-denial of what it means to Messiah, Peter's going to say, I got a better plan. But for understanding, though, the fact that he must do this, it's so important. In order for true forgiveness to be offered and for God to be a God of justice forever, things must happen this way. They have to happen this way. Let me illustrate it this way. Recently, I don't know, last month or so, a bunch of the neighborhood kids are in our basement. They're playing basketball on some kind of hoop that's about to fall over. And in our basement, there's a light fixture above, and somebody broke it. Now, everybody was sort of blaming each other on this, but only one shot, one ball from one kid at one time could have broke it, but whatever. So not only is the light bulb broken, but the entire fixture gets busted. And so, broken overhead light fixture, not an electrician, so Papa Bear not totally happy. However, in that moment, there's a couple of choices here. Once I find out, well, either I could say and demand, who was it? Who was the kid? You need to make a payment to this house now. I don't care how you do it, you need to go do it. There's one option. Second option, no more basketball forever from this point forward. None. Everybody cries. Okay, that's another one. Third option is, hey, it was a mistake. Let me say just, all is forgiven. I'll replace the light fixture. I'll do the work. We'll get that done. Then, of course, I thought of the fourth option, which is just let it be broken for a while and let the basement be dark and dank and disgusting, until you finally realize, I really got to fix that light. So it took a month or two of, it's really dark down here. Like, yeah, I know. Okay, I'm not going to I'm not going to be the hero of my own story here, but I will say it wasn't that expensive of a fixture. But, of course, I chose option 3, which is, okay, you did something wrong, but I'm going to hold that payment that maybe you might have to rightfully make, but I'm going to hold that payment against myself. I'll do the work. I'll replace the fixture. That's really what forgiveness truly is. Forgiveness is when you come to, when God comes to man, when you come to a person, you say, I'm going to absorb the suffering and the payment against myself and allow you to go free. I'll pay the debt that you rightfully owe. But I'm going to hold it against myself. And whenever you hold someone else's debt against yourself and you pay it, it always costs. It always hurts. Why people say, why is forgiveness so hard? It's because you're suffering. You're suffering. But you're doing it willingly. Why? Because you love the other person. What's generating the absorption of that suffering is your love for them because you want to see them go free. You don't want to say, hey, don't ever do that forever. That's cruel. That's taking away someone's joy. You can start being very demanding. Say, you pay it back. But as sinful people, who would know when that repayment would truly be made? So you paid back the fixture? Well, it's just not good enough. Yeah, you were careless. You need to learn your lesson. So I'm going to make you ... You see, when we start to enact our own sense of judgment, it becomes, in a sense, retaliatory and even revenge. Why? Because we don't know when to stop. We're sinful people. Why does it say in the Old Testament, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life? And people take that way too far, but all that is equality, a punishment that fits the crime. It's not necessarily looking at the particular figures themselves in the human body, but it's just we have a tendency to over-punish. We push things too far. Why? We're sinful people. We don't know where to stop. So Jesus here is teaching us something about the Son of Man must suffer and die. Why? Because for eternal justice to be made and executed and safe, the Son of Man must suffer these things in order for you to be able to go free, to offer pardon. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission for sin. That's the price that must be paid. He's not going to leave it to us to have to work our way out of that debt. He's going to pay the debt for us. He's going to hold that against himself so that we who are the guilty ones may live in freedom and may extend freedom and forgiveness in the same way, thus walking in his steps. That's why it's so hard to be a disciple at times. Because when we think of absorbing that cost, we don't want to, because we know it's going to hurt. And yet, when we do so, we act just like Jesus did. And Peter can't deal with this. Peter's got a rough road. So he begins to rebuke him. But you remember, if you think about that rebuke that Jesus comes back, Jesus counter-rebukes, Jesus rebukes the rebuke. He says, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me." That language it should remind you of Matthew chapter 4 when Jesus is being tempted by Satan. And when Satan takes Jesus to the mountaintop and says, all the kingdoms, you can have them. You can have all the glory. Just bow down and worship me. Jesus, he quotes the scripture. He won't be put to the Lord God won't be put to the test. Then he says, be gone, be gone. Why? Because the temptation of Satan was you can have all the glory without the suffering. And what was the same thing Peter wanted? All the glory without the suffering. Now Jesus is getting the temptation from his own inner circle. And so Jesus comes back with a very stinging rebuke. Get behind me, Satan. You don't have the things of God in mind. You've got the things of man in mind. And I won't be tempted in that way. I won't be put to the test. You're not going to dictate to me that glory will not come with suffering. It will. Why? Because that's the only way you're going to be forgiven. That's the way forgiveness works in God's economy. The Son of Man must do this. In fact, if you start to think about then, what must happen for the disciples is the same, it is very similar if they're going to work out what it means to be a true follower of Jesus. See, Peter's having his men walking like trees moment here. He gets the identity, he just doesn't get the implications of it. He had his own thing in mind, which is, I think, why Jesus strictly ordered him, be quiet. You don't quite get it yet. And so here now, Jesus calls his followers, and frankly, anyone who cares to listen, to a 2020 vision of what it truly means for him to be the Messiah and for them to be his follower, that it's about the cross, the cross. So Jesus' identity, suffering, submission, and self-denial comes in the same idea as taking up your cross. To lose your life may not necessarily mean you're burned at the stake or die in some kind of way of martyrdom, but it means he is your life now. He is your life. Jesus is basically saying, I am your life. You give yourself to me. You know, nice teachers and good moral examples don't say things like this. Only messiahs do. And you have to see the difference in that, because this is where the rubber meets the road for the disciples. This is why this is the high point of the book. The identity is out there. Now it's the mission. What does it truly mean? He asks the question, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his life? What a question. Only God can ask that question of a person. What he's saying here is it's a totally radical thing. It's a dividing point for people's lives. It's the reason why your holidays are tense, because you've given your life to Christ and other people around the table have not. That is a divisive point for people. He's saying that your whole identity must be found in me. Your whole identity. Don't get me wrong. Because some people ask the really basic questions. Well, does that mean I have to stop loving the Cavs or the Browns? Well, maybe you could stop loving the Browns, but am I not left-handed anymore? No, of course you're left-handed. It's not some of those details. It's where your affections lie. It's how your agenda gets set. It's the kind of, you realize that you do not belong to yourself anymore. You belong to him. I understand where my true life is now found. I'm going to live for the person who's given it to me. That's my identity. That's what I'm made of now. I saw the movie over the break, Jumanji. That movie's all about identity. High school kids find themselves in a game. They take on new abilities. The real question of the movie is, who are you? Who are you? The culture loves to ask this question. We're in an identity crisis as a culture. And movies like this come out, and it's so funny because it's a little dated in the way it's presented from the original, but it's like there's the jock, there's the popular girl, there's the kind of the gamer, geeky guy, and then there's the loner. You know, it's like 4 very stereotypical categories, and then they take on new identities inside the game. But the real question is, like, who are you really? What's your true identity? Who do you want to be? And when Jesus comes, what he's basically saying the same thing. Do you see me? Do you understand what I'm saying? And do you understand, if you're really going to have true life, you need to find it in me. I am going to come, and the reason I'm here is essentially for me to swallow you up, for you to become one with me. I am your life. And so now, what that does for all of us, I think we have to stop and say, okay, well, what is my identity really? Because when you're in high school, yeah, you do identify in some of those little categories, don't you? Well, I'm the athlete, I'm the academic, I'm going here, I'm doing this, and you start to ask some of those questions about yourself, and then as you get older, you start to change some of those identity answers to those questions. I'm a mom, I'm a CPA, I'm a graduate of, I live over here. And then maybe beyond that, or in the middle of that, your identity even more so goes to performance. I'm a good person. I've done some, but, And so performance-based identity starts to kind of take over. And when Jesus comes, what he's saying is it's not you switch from whatever that performance-based identity is, like, oh, I've done a lot of bad things in my life, but now I'm going to commit myself to being much better. I'm going to get my life on track here with Jesus. He's not saying that. Because he's not calling you to some kind of moralism. But that's what a lot of people think. I got a New Year's resolution. I'm going to church. How long does that last? Maybe a couple weeks? That guy's boring up there on stage. He talks way too long. True. But what he's calling you to say is, my identity, your identity is my life. That's what I'm calling you to. You don't just switch it. He comes to tell you to truly understand what your life is. And when you actually suffer hardship for his sake, then you've understood what the cross really is. He's not saying bear your cross, get over whatever malady you may have. You bore your cross today. When you bear your cross, what you are doing is you're taking up his life and suffering hardship because of him. That's what it means to take up your cross. And so sight is the parable, and this is where we'll finish. We have to stop. Sight is the parable. The implication really of what Jesus' identity is the big question for all of us. Do I really understand that? Am I really willing to say he is my identity? He is my life. When I was in high school, I couldn't ever understand in biology class the microscope thing with the 3 prongs. I was terrible at that. And so I would look in the thing, I'd look at the slide, I swear there was nothing on my slide. The teacher would ask from the front as we all had our microscopes, do you see anything? Do you see that? Everybody's kind of like, I just faked. Yeah, I don't think I saw anything. I was always wrong. And I just started to nod my head until I started to make things a little bit more clear. I was always constantly switching those little 3-prong things to try and find something. And then eventually I saw something a little bit hazy. I don't know if that was the right thing or the wrong thing. And then at one point or another, I finally saw what I needed to see. I still don't think I did very well on the test, but I remember for a long time just faking it. When she asked the question, I didn't want to be the one singled out and say, I can't see it. She stopped class and come all the way over and show me. So I see it. I see it. And I think a lot of people go through that when they're thinking about where they're at spiritually. And the question is asked here, do you see it? Yeah, I see it. Yeah, but maybe you don't really. And here's the thing, as a pastor, I would love to help you locate it. I think there's a lot of people here that would do the same, whether it's in a community team or wherever it is. Don't leave this place. If you see things in a hazy sense, or you're blind and you want to see, or we could pray together that, Lord, you will open blind eyes. Please do that today. That's what we're praying for. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for the fact that when our eyes were blind, when we had no clue, when we were covered in mud and dirt and our own moral filth, you came into our lives and you did something that we didn't deserve. You opened our eyes. You led us by the hand. You took us away. You showed us personally what it meant to follow you. We pray today, Lord, that today would be the day of salvation. For some people here who may say, I've never had that moment, or I think it's hazy and I think I need more clarity. We pray, Lord, this morning that you will provide that kind of clarity today, and that you'll help us to trust in you the most as we go from this place, Lord, if we've been trusting in ourselves. Help us, Lord, to find our lives swallowed up in yours. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.